I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but when you mentioned earlier that we don't have the conversation, or at least the conversation around recovery um, isn't prevalent within communities of color in the Black community. Why do you think that is?
I think there are a few different reasons, and and you and I know that the Black community is not a monolith. So you're talking about, like, if you're looking at the Black faith community,
Yep.
for instance, there is a I don't know if what word I'm looking for here, but there are a lot of people who get sober through their churches.
Hmm.
They look at their drinking, they're brought into a pastor or a clergyman to look at their drinking, or a fellow who's gone through the process of getting sober through the church. And that seems to be an appropriate way to deal with it, is to kind of keep it in the community
Hmm.
and not go outside to one of these other sober support groups, but to go straight into the church, find your sobriety there, and then stay there
Yep.
with it. Um, and the Black faith community is very large. It's very large, and I think it's probably the predominant Black community. And I'm not just talking about Christianity, but any faith.
Sure.
Um, so I think that's one reason, is that we keep it in house that way. Another reason is, what I find with a lot of cultures, that even subcultures of Caucasians, which is, you don't talk about these things outside the family,
Yep.
and to ask for help is a sign of weakness, that is a sign of shame. So you're bringing shame on the family. One, if you're a drunk and you can't keep yourself together, that's a source of shame. But two, if you have to go tell people our business in order to get help with that, nobody likes that. So you figure out another way. You just, like, either be a man or be a woman, and, think of your children, or think of whatever, like whatever you need to do to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But you don't go and sit in these groups and tell people all your business like that. That just doesn't sit well with a lot of people, especially, um, my generation, or even millennials. I think that there's an idea, that mental health isn't paramount.
Yeah.
It doesn't come before everything. And I think Gen Z kind of has it right. Gen Z is quick to tell you when they need a mental health day.
Of
Like,
course.
they're not showing up at work that day. But my generation, and millennials, we were raised differently. I won't speak to millennials, but my generation, we were raised differently. And I'll be 60 in August and 16 in July,
Love that.
sobriety wise. So I I was raised with a very much, we keep it in house mentality in my culture, not in my home,
Yep.
but in my
It's a
culture.
it's
That
a
that
macro
was
issue
the
for sure.
messaging. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's why I think that we don't talk about recovery outside of our communities. And not that recovery couldn't happen within the community in those sober support groups, but because those sober support groups are seen to be outside of our community, whatever those groups are, whether it be AA or Smart Recovery, or the Tempest, or We Are the Luckiest, or what is Annie Grace's? Is this
This
Naked
naked mind.
Mind? Yeah. So there are all these different ways that people can get sober, but they all seem to be pretty white,
Yeah. I don't
right?
I
They
don't I
all,
don't think your assumption is off.
yeah. So the idea of sending somebody into that white community to get help is probably scary
Yeah.
too.
It's there's so much wrapped up into that. I think you're spot on. And I you know, when I think about that, and there's this term that keeps coming to my mind, that, on an individual micro level and on a macro level, that silence is not a coping mechanism, right? And culturally speaking, everything that you said is entirely accurate. But this is, as we all know, is a symptom of such something much larger, right? So when you talk about actual healing, within the broader context of recovery, all of the work that needs to be done, I don't know how. an individual can do that or a culture can do that unless you're willing to put your laundry out, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how you can do it. So I'm here for the day when that pendulum starts shifting. I think it's starting to happen in a lot of ways, in the far reaching corners of Instagram where, people are talking about it and it's starting, maybe the algorithm will decide to give it some love at some point and it'll fly a little bit harder. Um because my fear is that the opposite side of that coin is that recovery doesn't belong to us. That healing doesn't belong to us, right? Because we don't have either the spaces and we're not willing to go into the spaces that are embracing these conversations that we find really uncomfortable to have in the open. And
Yeah.
I think that that's really unfortunate, which is one of the reasons why I do think stash is really important. So I get it that a lot of white women are the ones reading your book. But the beautiful thing about books and all of these other pieces of media, hopefully, and content that we're all creating, is that they'll live long after we're gone, right? And someone 50 years from now who's looking for support, who's looking for that story to give them a little bit more hope and strength to take it to the next step, will find it, and perhaps they find that in stash. And if it weren't for you, that wouldn't exist.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that is exactly my hope too. And honestly, like since it's been out in paperback, I've been doing a lot of Black book clubs, which
Cool.
has been really, really satisfying to me. And not I'm not just talking about like somebody who has a book club in their living room, every month. I'm talking about these nationwide, worldwide book clubs where they have like 55 chapters and there are so many Black ones. And I've been really, really excited to start spreading the word and they're finding my book. And it's book clubs really like fiction. So that's one of the challenges.
Yeah.
But the people who aren't challenged by that have been discovering it that way. So that's my hope is that somebody struggling, somebody maybe who isn't even struggling has heard of my book and recommends it to somebody who is struggling. And so they can take whatever they need from it, but they can also feel that they're not alone. They're not the only one in the room.
I love that.